It is the year 667. On a tiny volcanic island in the Banda Sea, a man is about to be executed. His crime is not murder or treason. He picked a nut. The nut in his hand, smaller than a walnut, brown and unremarkable at first glance, was worth more than its weight in gold. Across Europe, a single pound of this spice could buy a ship. A handful could set a man up for life. The Dutch East India Company, the richest corporation the world had ever seen, had declared a monopoly on this nut, and they enforced it with the full brutality of an empire. They burned every tree on every other island. They slaughtered or enslaved anyone who dared to trade it. And here, on this one island, they guarded the grooves with an army. The man being led to the block had simply tried to take one nut home. One nut. It was a price measured in blood, in lives, in islands conquered and cultures erased. And all of it, all of this horror and wealth and obsession, was for a spice you can now buy for $3 at any supermarket. A spice your grandmother probably keeps in a dusty jar at the back of her cabinet. Nutmeg. How did something so ordinary become the most valuable commodity on earth? How did a single nut rewrite the map of the world, launch the age of colonialism, and nearly start a war between the two most powerful empires on the planet? This is the story of nutmeg, and it begins not in a European palace or a Dutch counting house, but in a jungle on the other side of the world, on a handful of islands that most people have never heard of. Pay attention to this next part because it explains everything. The story of nutmeg begins on the Banda Islands, 10 tiny specks of volcanic earth in the eastern Indonesian archipelago. Today, they are part of a country most people could not find on a map. But 500 years ago, these islands were the only place on earth where nutmeg grew. Not in Africa, not in the Americas, only here. The tree itself is unassuming, a broad-leaved evergreen that can grow to 60 feet, with small yellow fruit that splits open when ripe, when reveal a single seed. That seed is nutmeg. Wrapped around it is a lacy red covering called mace, another spice entirely. One tree produces both of the most valuable commodities in the medieval world. The first people to understand this were the Bandanese themselves. They had lived on these islands for thousands of years, trading nutmeg with passing ships from Java and China. They did not know that the spice they used for medicine and flavor was about to become the object of the world's most desperate hunger. In those ancient times, nutmeg was not yet a global obsession. It was a local secret. The Bandanese used it to treat stomach aches, to preserve food in the tropical heat, and as a fragrant addition to their cooking. They had no idea that on the other side of the world, kings were willing to pay a fortune for just a taste. The first outsiders to learn of nutmeg were Arab traders. They sailed across the Indian Ocean in dhows, riding the monsoon winds, and they discovered the Banda Islands by following the scent. It is said you could smell the nutmeg grooves from a mile out at sea. The Arabs kept the source of the spice a secret for centuries. They told wild stories to protect their monopoly, that nutmeg grew only in paradise, that it was guarded by winged serpents, that any man who tried to harvest it would be struck dead by the gods. These were lies, of course, but they were effective lies. For hundreds of years, the Arab traders controlled the entire nutmeg trade. They bought it cheap in the Bandas, sailed it across the ocean, and sold it to Venetian merchants at astronomical prices. And Venice? They sold it to the rest of Europe for even more. By the time nutmeg reached a kitchen in London or Paris, it had passed through a dozen hands. Each one took a profit. Each one marked up the price. By the time it reached the table, a single nutmeg cost more than a cow. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Because while the Arabs and the Venetians grew rich on the spice trade, the people who actually grew the nutmeg lived in wooden huts, and saw almost none of that wealth. They traded their island's treasure for cotton cloth and iron tools. They had no idea that their home was about to become the most contested piece of land on earth. The first Europeans to reach the Banda Islands were the Portuguese. In Finfine Wanon, they conquered Malacca, the great trading port on the Malay Peninsula, and from there they pushed east, driven by a single obsession, to find the source of the spices that had made Venice rich. When they finally landed on Banda, they found something they did not expect. The islands were not a kingdom. There was no single ruler to bribe or conquer. The Bandanese lived in small villages, each led by a council of elders, and they had been trading with outsiders for centuries. They were willing to trade with the Portuguese too, but the Portuguese want more than trade. They wanted control. They built a fort on the island of Neira and tried to force the Bandanese to sell only to them. The Bandanese resisted, not with war but with simple refusal. They sold to whoever arrived first. The Portuguese could not enforce a monopoly on an archipelago of 10 islands with no central authority. They left frustrated, their dream of a nutmeg empire and finish, but they left behind something else. Knowledge. They mapped the islands. They recorded the winds and the currents. And when their ships returned to Europe, they carried stories of place where nutmeg grew on trees, so plentiful you could pick it off the ground. Those stories reached another nation, one that was just beginning to flex its muscles on the world stage. The Dutch. In 1599, a Dutch fleet under the command of Jacob van Neck arrived in the Banda Islands. They had sailed for over a year past the Cape of Good Hope, across the Indian Ocean, through pirate-infested waters, and when they dropped anchor, they found the Bandanese waiting for them with open arms. The Bandanese had grown tired of the Portuguese. They had heard rumors of another European power, one that might offer better prices and fairer treatment. They agreed to trade with the Dutch. The deal they signed was simple. The Dutch would buy all the nutmeg the islands could produce, and in return, they would protect the Bandanese from the Portuguese. It seemed like a good deal for everyone. It was not. The Dutch had no intention of being fair trading partners. They had come to the East Indies with a single purpose: to seize control of the spice trade by any means necessary. They had the ships, the guns, and the ruthless ambition of a young empire. And they had a plan that would change everything. The plan was called the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC. It was not a company in the modern sense. It was a state-sponsored monopoly with its own army, its own navy, its own currency, and the power to wage war and sign treaties. It answered to no one, and its shareholders expected a return on their investment. The VOC looked at the Banda Islands and saw not a people, but a resource. And they decided that the only way to control the resource was to control the island completely. Every tree, every nut, every human being who might try to trade it outside their monopoly. The Bandanese had no idea what was coming. What came was a man named Jan Pieters June Koen. He was the Governor-General of the VOC. And he was perhaps the most ruthlessly to colonial administrator in history. Koen looked at the situation in Banda and saw a problem. The Bandanese were still trading with other merchants. English ships had begun to appear in the islands, offering higher prices. The monopoly was leaking. Koen decided that the only solution was total control. In Wexington he arrived in Banda with a fleet of 9 ships and over 1,000 soldiers, including Japanese, Rangan mercenary. The Bandanese, who had no standing army, were caught completely off guard. Koen invited the village leaders to a meeting to negotiate a new treaty. They came armed, expecting to talk. Instead, they were arrested. 44 of them were beheaded on the spot. The rest taken away in chains. What followed was a systematic campaign of terror. The Dutch soldiers swept across the islands, burning villages, slaughtering the inhabitants, and hunting down anyone who tried to escape into the jungle. The Bandanese fought back with whatever they had: bamboo spears, poison arrows, the desperate courage of men with nothing left to lose. But against Dutch muskets and cannons, they stood no chance. By the time the killing was done, the population of the Banda Islands had been reduced from roughly 15,000 to fewer than 1,000. The survivors were enslaved and put to work in the nutmeg grooves. The island belonged to the VOC now. Every tree, every nut, every inch of soil. Koen declared that anyone caught growing nutmeg outside the company's designated plantations would be executed. Anyone caught selling nutmeg to a non-Dutch buyer would be executed. Anyone caught stealing a single nut from the grooves would be executed. The punishment was absolute, and it was enforced without mercy. This is the part most people never learn about, because the story of nutmeg is not just a story of trade and exploration, it is a story of genocide. The Bandanese people, who lived on those islands for thousands of years, who had discovered nutmeg and tended its trees long before any European knew it existed, were wiped out. so that a corporation in Amsterdam could control the global supply of a cooking spice. And the Dutch were not done yet. They had the islands, but they did not have a complete monopoly. There was still a problem. The English had gotten their hands on nutmeg trees. They had smuggled seedlings out of Banda and planted them on another island, Run, which they controlled. The Via had to have Run. The negotiations between the Dutch and the English over this tiny island would lead to one of the most absurd trades in history. The English demanded compensation for giving up Run. The Dutch offered something in return. Something far away. Something they considered worthless. They offered a small, swampy island on the other side of the world, a place the English had been trying to settle for years with little success. The name of that island was Manhattan. In 1667, the Treaty of Breda was signed. The Dutch got Run, the English got Manhattan, a single nutmeg island for the city that would become the financial capital of the world. And no, that is not something anyone made up. The Treaty of Breda gave the VOC something they had been chasing for decades, a complete R-type monopoly on the world's nutmeg supply. Every single nutmeg that reached a European kitchen now passed through Dutch hands. And the Dutch made sure that the price stayed high. They did this through a simple, brutal system of artificial scarcity. The VOC ordered that all nutmeg trees outside the Banda Islands be destroyed. They sent patrols to every island in the region, burning grooves, uprooting seedlings, and paying local rulers to report any wild nutmeg trees they found. On the islands they controlled, they limited production to a few carefully managed plantations. They harvested only as much as the market could bear at premium prices. The rest of the crop was burned, dumped into the sea, destroyed rather than sold cheap. The logic was simple. If nutmeg was rare, it was valuable. And if it was valuable, the VOC could charge whatever they wanted. They built a fortress on the island of Banda Nera, Fort Belgica, to guard the grooves. Its walls were 30 feet thick. Inside, Dutch soldiers lived in constant vigilance, watching for smugglers, poachers, and anyone who might try to steal a single nut. The trees themselves were treated like state secrets. Every nut was counted. Every harvest was recorded. The workers, enslaved Bandanese, and imported slaves from other Dutch colonies were kept in chains and worked until they dropped. The conditions were so brutal that the average life expectancy of a slave on the nutmeg plantations was less than 5 years. But the VOC did not care. The profits were too enormous. In Amsterdam, the shareholders of the VOC were receiving dividends over 40% per year. The company was the richest corporate in history, worth more than many countries. And all of it, all that wealth, all that blood, all that systematic cruelty, was built on a spice that most people used to flavor a pudding or a glass of mulled wine. The VOC monopoly on nutmeg lasted for nearly 200 years. It was the longest, most profitable monopoly in the history of world trade. But like all monopolies, it could not last forever. The cracks began to appear in the late 18th century. The French, the British, and other European powers were growing tired of Dutch dominance. They wanted their own piece of the spice trade, and they had a secret weapon, the nutmeg tree itself. For all the VOC's efforts to control the supply, they could not control nature. Birds ate the fruit and flew to other islands. Seeds drifted on ocean currents. And more than once, a determined smuggler managed to escape the patrols with a handful of seedlings. The French succeeded first. In 1770, a French bâtisseur Puertois named Pierre Poix Liberty Pepper managed to smuggle nutmeg seedlings out of the Dutch East Indies and establish plantations on the island of Mauritius. From there, the trees spread to other French colonies. The British followed soon after, transplanting nutmeg to their own colonies in the Caribbean, particularly Grenada. The monopoly was broken, and with the monopoly broken, the price of nutmeg began to fall. It would take another century for the spice to become truly cheap, but the process had begun. The age of nutmeg as a world-shaping force was coming to an end. I mean, think about that for a second. A single spice had launched the age of colonial empire. It had caused a genocide. It had traded hands for an island that would become New York. And now it was becoming ordinary. By the middle of the 9th century, the Dutch monopoly was dead. Nutmeg was being grown in the Caribbean, in Africa, in India, and in dozens of other tropical locations. The price collapsed. What had once cost a king's ransom now cost a few pennies. The spice that had driven men to genocide and nations to war became a common household ingredient, sitting on shelves next to cinnamon and cloves, unremarkable and cheap. But the story of nutmeg did not end there, because as the spice became ordinary, something strange happened. People began to notice its other effects. For centuries, it had been known that nutmeg could do more than just flavor food. In large quantities, it was hallucinogen. The compound myristicin, found in nutmeg seed, breaks down in the body into a substance similar to amphetamines. Consume enough of it, and you will experience vivid hallucinations, a sense of unreality, and a profound disconnection from your own body. It is not a pleasant experience. Most people who try it report nausea, dizziness, and a crushing headache that lasts for days. But that did not stop people from trying. In the prisons of colonial America, inmates would grind nutmeg into a powder and swallow it to escape the monotony of their cells. In the hippie counterculture of the 1960s, nutmeg was used as a cheap substitute for LSD or marijuana. It was accessible, it was legal, and it was terrible. The effects of nutmeg intoxication are unpredictable and often dangerous. At high doses, it can cause seizures, heart palpitations, and organ damage. There have been documented cases of death from nutmeg overdose. It is not a recreational drug, it is a poison. But the fact that it could be used that way at all reveals something about the nature of the spice. Nutmeg has always been a substitute. For the ancient Romans, it was a medicine. For the medieval Europeans, it was a cure for the plague of belief that had no basis in reality, but persisted for centuries. Because nutmeg was so rare and expensive that people assumed it must be magical. For the Bandinese, it was a sacred ingredient, used in rituals and healing ceremonies. And for the Dutch, it was the engine of the world's first global corporation. Every age has seen something different in the nutmeg seed. Every culture has projected its own desires onto it. And now, in the modern age, we see seed as something else entirely. A cheap flavoring for eggnog and pumpkin spice lattes, a nostalgic scent that appears every December and vanishes by January. But the truth is that nutmeg has not changed. We have. The world has become so wealthy, so intricate, and so industrialized that a spice once worth an island is now worth nothing. And that is the real story of nutmeg. It is not a story about the spice itself. It is a story about value, about what we choose to treasure and what we choose to forget, about the distance between a handful of dust and a mountain of gold, and how that distance can disappear in the span of a few centuries. This is the part that most people never learn about, because when you sprinkle nutmeg on your latte this winter, you are not just adding flavor. You are adding a history of violence, of obsession, of human beings treated as commodities so that a commodity could be treated as a treasure. You are adding the ghost of a people who no longer exist, and the echo of an empire that ruled the world through the control of a single nut. And now nutmeg sits your kitchen, in a jar, on a shelf, next to the salt and the pepper and the garlic powder, unremarkable and cheap, a background character in the daily drama of your meals. You probably bought it for a few dollars. You probably use it once or twice a year. You probably never think about where it came from. But the next time you open that jar, consider this. That brown dust in your hand is the residue of an empire. It is the powdered bones of a forgotten people. It is a piece of history so strange and so brutal that if you read it in a novel, you would call it unrealistic. A spice that launched 1,000 ships. A spice that caused a genocide. A spice that was traded for the island of Manhattan. A spice that was guarded by armies, hoarded by monopolies, and fought over by the most powerful nations on earth. And now it sits in your kitchen, worth less than a loaf of bread. There is a lesson in that. About impermanence, about the strange alchemy of value, about how the things we treasure most are often the things we understand least. The Bandinese did not understand what they had. They saw nutmeg as a useful plant, a source of medicine and flavor, a part of their daily life. They did not see it as a weapon. The Dutch did. They saw it as a tool for domination, a lever to move the world. And they moved it. They built an empire on a nut. They destroyed a culture for a nut. They reshaped the map of the world for a nut. And then in the end, they lost it all anyway. Because empires are not built on spices, they are built on people. And people, unlike nutmeg, cannot be controlled forever. The Dutch East India Company, the richest corporate in history, went bankrupt in 8800. Its assets were seized. Its records were scattered. Its fortresses crumbled into ruins. The Banda Islands, once the most valuable real estate on Earth, are now a quiet tourist destination, known mainly for diving and snorkeling. The nutmeg trees still grow there, but nobody fights over them anymore. And the Bandanese? The few who survived the genocide were scattered across the Dutch colonies, their language lost, their culture erased, their history written by the people who worded them and the Den. The few. Today, there are no pure-blooded Bandanese left. The people who discovered nutmeg, who tend its trees for thousands of years, who traded it with the world before the world knew it existed, are gone. All that remains is the spice and the story, which is why this channel exists. Because stories like this deserve to be told, not as dry history, but as living narrative. As a reminder that everything in your life, every object, every ingredient, every ordinary thing, has a hidden history. A history of struggle and suffering and triumph and loss. A history that connects you to people you will never meet, places you will never visit, and events that shape the world you live in. The nutmeg in your kitchen is not just a spice. It is a time machine. It is a window into a world that no longer exists. And the next time you taste it, I want you to remember the man who was executed for picking a single nut. I want you to remember the Bandanese who died so that a corporation could profit. I want you to remember the trade that gave New York to the English and a Nutmeg Island to the Dutch. And I want you to ask yourself, what other ordinary things in your life have extraordinary stories? That is the question this channel exists to answer. Every week, we take one everyday thing of food, a commodity, a household item, and we dig into its hidden history. We find the stories that nobody tells, the stories that explain how the world became what it is. If that sounds interesting to you, if you want to see the world differently, if you want to see civilization, if you want to understand the hidden forces that shaped civilization, then hit that subscribe button. Because next week, we are going to look at something else. Something you probably have in your kitchen right now. Something ordinary. Something you have never thought about twice. And I promise you, its story will change the way you see everything. Which part of this story surprised you the most? Was it the genocide? The trade for Manhattan? The fact that nutmeg is a hallucinogen? Let me know in the comments. I read everyone. And until next time, keep your eyes open. The history of the world is hiding in plain sight.